Hello everyone. Before we begin today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel is losing traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can help us. It's quick, free, and allows us to continue bringing you great content. Your support means everything. Let's keep this channel growing collectively. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Have you ever wondered what secrets might be buried right in the heart of a quiet American town? Behind every peaceful street and every friendly smile, there could be stories darker than anyone dares to imagine. Today, we uncover one such chilling case, a story of silence, hidden graves, and the relentless pursuit of justice. If you love true crime stories that keep you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to subscribe to this channel and turn on the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss the next story that will make you think twice about what lies beneath the surface of everyday life. It was the summer of 2022 when the quiet town of Plaquemine, Louisiana, found itself at the center of a nightmare no one could have imagined. The people there had always known their home for its endless fields of sugarcane, the winding river, and the hum of cicadas on hot evenings. Neighbors trusted one another. Doors were left unlocked, and life felt steady, unchanged for decades. But beneath that calm surface, hidden in the shadow of a small, neglected farm, an unspeakable secret had been festering for years. It began with the smell. Folks who lived down the road from the Dawson property sometimes mentioned a strange, sour odor drifting in the wind on humid days. They joked it might be the chickens Henry Dawson kept, or maybe a dead raccoon rotting in the woods. No one pressed too hard. After all, Henry was just that odd little man who kept to himself. He wasn't friendly, but he wasn't the kind of troublemaker anyone would suspect either. Most thought he was simply reclusive, a loner lost in his own world. The truth was far darker. Henry Dawson had turned his patch of land into something unimaginable, a burial ground for the dozens of men who had disappeared without a trace. These weren't just strangers. They were sons, brothers, fathers. Hardworking men who had traveled through Louisiana searching for day labor, looking to put food on the table during tough times. Between 2019 and 2022, nearly 50 of them had vanished into thin air, their families left with nothing but questions and grief. And all along, their final resting place lay just a few feet beneath the Louisiana soil, covered over with weeds and the careless footprints of the man who had ended their lives. When the news broke, it rattled every corner of the state. Headlines called it one of the most gruesome crime scenes ever uncovered in Louisiana's history. Reporters swarmed the town, cameras flashing as investigators dug deep into the Dawson property, unearthing human remains one after another. Neighbors stood behind the police tape, clutching their mouths in disbelief. Some cried, some prayed. Many whispered the same question: how could this have happened here? And perhaps the most chilling detail of all was Henry himself. Small-framed, unassuming, with a vacant look in his eyes, he didn't appear like a monster. He had no record, no reputation for violence. Just a quiet farmer with a rundown house on the edge of town. Yet behind that mask of mediocrity was a man driven by greed, cruelty, and an obsession with power, an obsession that would claim the lives of dozens. What unfolded in Plaquemine was not just a story about one man's evil. It was also about the silence of a community, the overlooked cries of the vulnerable, and the tragic reminder that the darkest dangers can lurk in the most ordinary places. Long before the people of Plaquemine would speak his name in fear, Henry Dawson was just a boy growing up on a worn piece of farmland near the Mississippi River. From the outside, the Dawson family seemed ordinary enough. His mother worked hard to stretch every dollar, his father labored in the cane fields, and Henry, small, quiet, and fragile, was their only child. But inside that weathered wooden house, the way Henry was raised set him on a path few could have predicted. His father adored him to the point of blindness. To neighbors, it looked like love. To Henry, it became entitlement. While other boys in town were expected to haul water, mend fences, or rise before dawn to feed livestock, Henry was excused from every chore. If he dragged his feet, his father carried him. If he refused to help, his father told him he was too special for such work. Each indulgence carved deeper the belief that Henry was above the rules that governed everyone else. His mother saw the damage, but her voice was drowned out. She would try to place a broom in Henry's hand or nudge him toward helping in the garden, only for her husband to step in and scold her, insisting the boy shouldn't be treated like a servant. Over time, she stopped trying. Henry grew up in a world where others bent around his will, a world where responsibility was always someone else's burden. At school, reality struck harder. His classmates didn't see him as special, they saw him as weak. His thin frame and timid manner made him a target. They shoved him aside in games, laughed at his size, and left him standing alone. Those taunts burned. Each insult clashed with the story his father had told him at home, a story where he was the center of the universe. The contradiction festered into resentment. Henry began to pull away. Instead of seeking friends, he turned inward. He spent long hours in his room, nose buried in books. But they weren't the harmless adventure stories his teachers hoped he might read. He was drawn instead to tales of war, conquest, and ruthless leaders. In those pages, Henry found men who commanded armies, who decided who lived and who died. For a boy who often felt powerless, these stories offered a dangerous kind of refuge. Meanwhile, life in Plaquemine was changing. Many of the boys Henry grew up with left town as soon as they could, finding jobs in Baton Rouge or New Orleans. Some worked in factories, others joined the military. They sent money home, built families, and carved places for themselves in the world. Henry watched from the sidelines, unable or unwilling to follow. His family's farm declined. The roof leaked, weeds overtook the yard, animals went unfed. He let the decay spread, content to live in the ruins as long as his parents carried the weight. When his father's health failed, the moment to step up arrived. But Henry had no interest in responsibility. He didn't nurse his father or take over the work. Instead, he retreated further, avoiding the fields, avoiding neighbors, avoiding even his mother's weary gaze. The little boy who had once been carried on his father's back had become a man who expected the world to carry him still. Isolation hardened him. Neighbors who tried to offer work or friendship found Henry distant, cold, and sometimes unsettling. He would stare too long, his eyes vacant, yet sharp, as if he were measuring them. People whispered about his oddness, but in a rural town where privacy was respected, few pressed. He was dismissed as peculiar, not dangerous. Looking back, one might wonder if things could have turned out differently. What if Henry's father had taught him to sweat in the fields, to bear responsibility like every other boy? What if his mother's warnings had been heard? Could Henry Dawson have lived a quiet life, another anonymous farmer under the Louisiana sun? But life rarely bends to what-ifs. By the time Henry reached adulthood, his character was set. He had learned only that he was entitled to take, and that the world outside had humiliated him. Bitterness swelled, and with it a hunger for control. He wanted to feel stronger than those who once mocked him, stronger than the neighbors who pitied him, stronger than anyone who might cross his path. And as he grew more reclusive, he clung to the one escape he had always trusted: the stories of war and domination that filled his shelves. In those pages, Henry Dawson wasn't a frail, forgotten man. He was powerful, he was feared, and soon he would begin searching for a way to bring that fantasy into the real world. As Henry Dawson moved into adulthood, the gap between him and the rest of his generation widened. While many young men from Plaquemine were joining the military, finding steady work in Baton Rouge, or starting families, Henry stayed behind in the crumbling house he had grown up in. His clothes were worn, his fields overgrown, and the farm animals often went hungry. From the outside, he looked like a man stuck in place. But inside his head, he lived in a different world entirely. Henry had always been drawn to books. But by his 20s, his shelves were crowded with dog-eared paperbacks about wars and empires. He didn't read them for history or wisdom. What fascinated him were the ruthless choices, commanders ordering men into hopeless battles, rulers silencing rivals with a single command. Where others saw tragedy, Henry saw power. Those stories became fuel. He imagined himself as the kind of man who could bend others to his will. The humiliation of being small, overlooked, and mocked as a boy had left scars. Reading about conquerors allowed him to flip that script. On the page, weakness didn't matter, only dominance did. Henry's imagination wasn't passive. He practiced it in small, unsettling ways. A stray dog wandered into his yard one evening, ribs showing, tail tucked. Instead of helping, Henry cornered the animal, watching it tremble. When he finally drove it away with a stick, he stood in the yard afterward, not feeling guilt, but an odd thrill. The dog had feared him, and for a fleeting moment, that made him feel powerful. The pattern continued. He snapped at a neighbor who asked about his failing farm, enjoying the way the man backed off. He loomed over his mother when she tried to correct him, noting how her voice faltered. These were not grand victories, but to Henry they were proof that fear could replace respect, that intimidation could disguise weakness. Neighbors noticed his strange remarks. One recalled Henry saying, almost with pride, "A man's worth is measured by how many follow his orders." Another remembered him chuckling at a news story about a fight in town, muttering, "At least that guy knew how to take charge." People dismissed these comments as odd quirks from a loner, never realizing they were glimpses into a darker obsession. By now, Henry's identity was no longer tied to the failing farm or the quiet Louisiana town. It was tied to the fantasies that consumed him. He believed that strength came not from kindness, not from hard work, but from domination. And the more he fed that belief, the hungrier it grew. In the stillness of his nights, lying on his narrow bed, Henry replayed scenes from the books that had shaped him. He pictured himself as the commander, deciding who lived and who died. The thought no longer felt like fantasy. It felt like a rehearsal. The opportunity to act came sooner than anyone could have imagined. In the sweltering summer of 2019, Henry's septic tank overflowed, filling his yard with a stench he could no longer ignore. Fixing it would require money he didn't want to spend. Hiring a worker meant paying wages he resented. But then an idea took hold, one that blended his obsession with power and his lifelong greed. If he brought a laborer onto his property, no one would question it. Men came and went all the time in towns like Plaquemine, looking for a day's pay. And once the job was done, well, Henry had read enough stories about rulers eliminating problems before they could speak. For Henry Dawson, the line between fantasy and reality was about to vanish. His life of imagining control was about to give way to something far more chilling, the first act of violence that would set him on a path from being just an odd recluse to one of the most feared killers Louisiana had ever known. The summer of 2019 pressed down on Plaquemine with its usual weight air so thick with humidity it clung to the skin, the scent of cane fields heavy in every breath. At the Dawson farm, another smell mixed into the air, sharper and more sour. The septic tank had overflowed, soaking the soil behind the house with a stench that no breeze could carry away. Most men would have called a handyman, paid the fee, and been done with it. But Henry Dawson was not most men. He had no interest in spending money, and even less in doing the work himself. For days he paced the yard, staring at the ground, muttering to himself. The problem wasn't just the sewage, it was the idea of losing control, of being forced to part with something that was his. One morning, he walked into town, scanning the familiar corners where drifters often gathered. That's where he spotted James Miller, leaning against the wall of a convenience store. James was in his 50s, with sunburned skin and a frame worn down from years of labor. He had once worked at a plant in Houston, but layoffs had sent him down the highway, searching for work. In his pocket, he carried a folded photograph of his daughter, a reminder of who he was trying to help. Henry approached with an easy smile. "I've got a little job out on my property," he said. "Some digging work. Day's pay, cash in hand." James hesitated, but the thought of money that might mean groceries, maybe even a bus ticket back home, pulled him in. He agreed and followed Henry out of town. To James, the Dawson farm looked tired but ordinary. He set his shovel into the ground without suspicion, working steadily under the punishing Sunday. Henry stood nearby, watching. At first, his grip tightened and loosened on the iron pipe he had picked up, his mind racing. He could end it all by handing over a few bills. James would leave, and no one would be the wiser. But the thought of opening his wallet twisted inside him. More than that, another idea pulsed stronger. This is your chance. This is where you take control. James bent lower, sweat dripping from his brow, shovel biting deeper into the earth. Henry stepped forward. For a moment, the world seemed to still, the cicadas hushed, the air grew heavier. Then he swung. The blow landed with brutal finality. James crumpled to the ground, the shovel clattering beside him. Henry froze, chest heaving, staring at what he had done. But the terror he expected never came. Instead, a strange calm filled him, mixed with something darker relief, even exhilaration. Dragging the body toward the tree line, Henry used the same shovel to dig a shallow grave. He worked quickly, sweat running into his eyes, dirt clinging to his hands. With each scoop of soil, the act felt less like desperation and more like discovery. By the time he covered the mound, tamping it flat beneath his boots, Henry no longer felt weighed down. He felt lighter, almost cleansed. That night, lying in bed, he saw James's face again and again, not as a haunting, but as a memory he replayed with a shiver of satisfaction. The act had cost him nothing, no money, no argument, no consequences, just silence. What began as a way to avoid paying for labor had opened a new door inside him. Killing hadn't horrified him, it had thrilled him. For a man who had always felt small, overlooked, powerless, the act of deciding another man's fate had been intoxicating. But what truly sealed it was the ease. James Miller had vanished from the world in an afternoon, and no one knew. A man with a daughter waiting miles away was gone, and the earth behind Henry's house held the secret. There were no witnesses, no questions, no trace. Standing at the window in the days that followed, Henry looked out at his yard differently. Where others saw grass and trees, he saw potential. Problems could be solved here. Weakness could be erased here. Power could be claimed here. One grave was already in the soil. Soon, Henry would learn how simple it was to dig another, and another. Until the Dawson farm became more than a failing piece of land, it became his hidden kingdom, ruled by silence and fear. When James Miller vanished, no alarm sounded in Plaquemine. People assumed he had moved on like so many drifters before him. For Henry Dawson, that silence was more powerful than the killing itself. He had taken a life, buried it in his yard, and the world hadn't even blinked. That knowledge hardened into something more dangerous than the act. It became permission. It began with small excuses. The roof leaked when summer storms rolled through. A fence leaned crooked after years of neglect. Henry could have hired carpenters or handymen, but paying for work gnawed at him. Instead, he wandered to the gas stations and bus stops where unfamiliar men waited for day jobs. They were strangers, faces from Arkansas, Mississippi, Texas, hungry, desperate, grateful for the promise of cash. He spoke softly, the same practiced line. "A little work out on my property, cash when it's done." And each time someone followed him down the dusty road, glad for the chance. The pattern wrote itself. They worked hard under the sun, while Henry watched from the shade. When the task was nearly finished, when fatigue slowed their movements and their guard dropped, he struck. A pipe, a shovel, whatever was at hand. Quick, decisive, final. Then the dragging, the dirt, the silence. He became more efficient with every burial. He scattered leaves across disturbed ground, dragged branches to erase tracks, learned which corners of the yard sank easiest after rain. What had once been hesitation became routine. But the story did not end with Henry. Far away, families waited for men who never came home. A brother in Arkansas paced the porch at night, wondering why the phone stayed quiet. A daughter in Texas kept checking the mailbox for a letter that never arrived. Wives filed missing person reports, their voices cracking as they explained that their husbands weren't the kind to disappear. On paper, the cases piled up men with little money, no stable addresses, and no answers. Authorities shrugged, guessing they had drifted further south or slipped into trouble elsewhere. In Plaquemine, no one connected the dots. Neighbors sometimes caught glimpses of odd things: the flicker of a lantern in Henry's yard after midnight, the scrape of a shovel carried on the still air. A retired farmer named Walter Green once told his wife, "That Dawson boy is digging at strange hours." She shushed him, saying it wasn't their business. Henry had always been odd, always kept to himself. In a small town, people preferred not to pry. As the months passed, the killings blurred together even in Henry's mind. He remembered fragments: one man humming while he worked, another who spoke with a stutter but the faces faded. What remained was the feeling, the jolt of power that made him feel bigger than the scrawny boy the world had once mocked. What started as a way to save money had grown into a compulsion. Sometimes he lured men not because work was needed, but because silence in the house grew unbearable, and he craved the rush. By the end of the second year, the Dawson farm had become more graveyard than homestead. The earth was patched with hidden mounds, the soil turned and retuned so many times it seemed restless. To Henry, it was not decay but dominion. Each burial proved his control. Each disappearance confirmed his secret. But Henry wasn't the only soul caught in the web. Inside the sagging house, his wife Martha lived another kind of captivity. While the town looked away, she bore witness to the digging, the whispers, the terrible silence that followed each new arrival. Henry's kingdom of dirt and shadows was also her prison, and before long, she too would be pulled into the nightmare. While Henry was digging deeper into his darkness, Martha Dawson was living a quieter but equally cruel sentence. Long before the first grave was dug, she had already been trapped in a life of weakness and dependency. Frail from childhood illness, she was married off by parents who hoped Henry's land would give her security. Instead, it tied her to a man who would turn their home into a private hell. At first, Henry's mood seemed strange but tolerable. He kept to himself, spent long stretches pacing the yard or buried in his books, and though his silence weighed on her, it was better than violence. That illusion ended the night she followed the sound of a shovel into the yard. Lantern in hand, she froze at the sight of her husband dragging something heavy toward a pit. The glow caught an arm, pale and limp, slipping from the shadows. Henry looked up, his face smeared with sweat and dirt, and without a word he ordered her to hold the lantern higher. Terrified, Martha obeyed. From then on, she knew the truth. The killings became part of the rhythm of their home. Strangers arrived for day work, grateful for food at her kitchen table, unaware they were dining in their last home. Martha longed to warn them, but Henry's watchful glare silenced her. When the work ended and the yard grew quiet, Henry pressed the lantern into her trembling hands. She stood beside him while he buried them, the yellow light flickering over fresh soil. She never screamed. Fear sealed her voice. The beatings came whenever she hesitated. If she questioned him, his fists landed quick and hard. If she lingered too long at the market or avoided his orders, bruises bloomed across her arms and ribs. Neighbors noticed her thin frame, the way her eyes darted nervously. But when asked how she was, she forced a brittle smile. In Plaquemine, hardship was common. Few wanted to believe hers was different. Over time, Martha stopped trying to resist. Psychologists would call it learned helplessness, the state in which fear becomes so constant that a person no longer believes escape is possible. She went through her days cooking, cleaning, and keeping silent, while at night she lit Henry's way to the graves. She no longer cried when he woke her from bed. The tears had run out. She moved like a shadow, her spirit worn thin by secrets she could not share. Yet silence carried its own torment. Every thud of earth-striking flesh lodged itself in her memory. Every grave she illuminated felt like another chain binding her soul. She was not digging, but she was holding the light, not swinging the blows, but watching them fall. Each night carved away her humanity until she felt less like a wife and more like another ghost wandering the Dawson farm. To the outside world, Henry was the odd recluse on the edge of town, and Martha, the quiet wife who spoke little. But behind the walls of their sagging house, she was both prisoner and unwilling accomplice. Fear kept her tethered, guilt hollowed her out, and hope seemed as unreachable as the stars. Still, even in her despair, a part of her clung to the belief that such horrors could not remain hidden forever. Secrets had a way of surfacing, no matter how deep the soil. And as Henry grew bolder, digging larger holes to contain the mounting dead, Martha sensed that the earth itself was restless, unable to keep its silence much longer. By the third year of Henry Dawson's killings, the land itself seemed uneasy. The yard bore scars from too many shallow graves, the ground uneven, grass refusing to grow in certain patches. On sweltering Louisiana afternoons, a sour odor sometimes rose from the soil, drifting across the Dawson farm like a warning. Even Henry felt it, an invisible hand, tugging at his nerves. He realized the pattern could not continue. Digging a fresh hole for every man was sloppy, exhausting, and far too visible. So he conceived a new plan. Instead of scattering graves across his property, he would carve out one pit deep, wide, hidden among the trees, a place to swallow them all. The idea appealed to him not just for convenience, but for control. It felt organized, almost military, as though he were a commander arranging his soldiers in formation. Henry chose a damp corner of the yard where floodwaters often softened the earth. Day after day, he dug, sweat running down his spine. Martha sometimes forced to stand nearby with a lantern. The hole grew until it resembled a crude cellar, a cavity in the earth big enough to consume a dozen lives. To Henry, it was progress. To Martha, it was a nightmare deepening with every shovelful. The test came when Henry lured Daniel Harris, a young man barely in his 20s, back to the farm. Daniel had left home after heartbreak, traveling south in search of work. He was grateful for Henry's offer some digging, a hot meal, and cash to keep him moving. But as Daniel worked under the blazing sun, his shovel struck something solid. He crouched to clear the dirt, and a fragment of bone jutted up from the earth. He looked over his shoulder. "Is this a grave?" he asked, his voice uneasy. For a moment, Henry froze. His mind spun with images of exposure, police swarming, the farm laid bare. Daniel was young, strong, and his family lived nearby. If he vanished, people would come looking. Killing him here was too risky. For the first time, Henry felt genuine fear. He forced a chuckle. "Old family plot," he lied smoothly. "Folks buried kin here years back. Soil's good once you dig deeper. Keep going." Daniel's eyes lingered on him, suspicion flickering. That look alone told Henry he could not risk it. Within the hour, he dismissed the young man, shoving a few bills into his hand to send him away. Daniel left the Dawson place, confused but alive, unaware how close he had walked to death. Henry, however, could not forget it. That night he paced the floor, chewing at his nails, convinced Daniel might speak to someone. But as the days passed, and no knock came at the door, paranoia ebbed into arrogance. He told himself he had been clever, that the farm was still his fortress. Yet the encounter changed him. He no longer targeted just anyone. He sought men with no ties, drifters with no families waiting nearby. His hunting grew more selective, more cautious, but it did not stop. Bodies continued to vanish into the pit, stacked layer upon layer in the wet Louisiana soil. Each time, Martha stood nearby, the lantern trembling in her hands, her face pale against the glow. The silence that followed each burial pressed on her like a weight she could not throw off. The pit was more than a grave. It was a monument to her captivity, a reminder that she was trapped in Henry's empire of dirt and secrets. But for all his careful planning, Henry overlooked one truth. The earth keeps memories. The smell of decay seeped through the soil on hot days, sharp enough that stray dogs prowled near the fence, noses to the ground. Neighbors noticed odd lantern light flickering in the woods after midnight. And beyond Plaquemine, missing persons reports were piling up: fathers, brothers, sons who had vanished without trace, many last seen heading south through Louisiana. Henry convinced himself no one would ever connect the dots. But the pit, his grand solution, was also his undoing. It was too big, too heavy with evidence, too loud in its silence. Martha could feel it, a certainty gnawing at her every time she smelled the air or heard the shovel scrape against stone. Secrets buried so deep were bound to claw their way back up. And indeed, before long, people outside the Dawson farm would begin to ask questions. Families searching for loved ones, police looking over their growing files, neighbors who could no longer ignore the strange smells and restless nights. The pit was filling, and so was suspicion. By 2021, whispers of unease had begun to ripple through Plaquemine. Drifters had always passed through southern Louisiana, chasing odd jobs and moving on without farewell. But lately, families were reporting men who never came back, sons, brothers, husbands whose trails seemed to vanish somewhere near the small town. At first, the reports felt isolated. A mother in Arkansas called about her boy who stopped answering messages. A brother in Texas worried when his sibling missed a holiday visit. A wife in Mississippi appeared at a station clutching a photograph, insisting her husband wasn't the kind to leave without a word. Alone, each case seemed explainable. Together, they formed a troubling pattern. Detective Raymond Carter of the Iberville Parish Sheriff's Office noticed first. A seasoned officer with a quiet patience, Carter had learned to listen for echoes between cases. In late nights at his desk, he laid the files side by side. The faces were different, the ages varied, but one line connected them: Plaquemine. Nearly all of the missing men had last been seen passing through the area, often mentioning work. The puzzle gnawed at him. Were they victims of trafficking? Had a criminal ring targeted transients along the highway? Carter pulled in colleagues from neighboring parishes, compared lists, even reached out to federal agents. But the trail remained cold. No witnesses, no bodies, no evidence beyond absence itself. Families grew desperate. Some came to town, showing photographs in diners and gas stations, asking anyone if they had seen their loved ones. One waitress remembered a young man who had stopped by, saying someone outside of town had promised him work. Days later, she saw his face on a missing poster. The memory sent a chill down her spine. The community could no longer ignore it. Flyers crowded bulletin boards. At church, prayers were offered for families still searching. At the grocery store, neighbors whispered about the number of men who had disappeared, yet no one thought of Henry Dawson. His farm had always been odd, but in small towns, oddity often passed for privacy. Strange smells from his property were dismissed as septic trouble. The flicker of lantern light in the woods was chalked up to eccentric habits. No one wanted to imagine what truly lay beneath his soil. For Martha Dawson, the growing suspicion outside felt like a storm gathering at the horizon. She heard the whispers at the market, the quiet prayers at church. Each word cut deep, for she knew exactly where those men were. Families searched with hope. She lived with the certainty of their fate. At home, she stood by the window, watching Henry pace the yard, shovel over his shoulder. Guilt pressed on her chest like a stone, heavier with every flyer she saw in town. Henry, meanwhile, reveled in arrogance. "Cops don't chase ghosts," he told Martha one evening, his voice dripping with contempt. "They're busy chasing truckers and smugglers. They don't care about drifters." He mistook the silence of law enforcement for ignorance, never realizing it was only the pause before pursuit. By autumn, tension spilled into public view. At a town meeting, one man rose and asked the question on everyone's mind: how can so many men vanish in a place this small, and nobody knows why? His words left the room in uneasy silence. In that moment, Plaquemine felt the weight of fear settle over it. Detective Carter pressed harder, revisiting reports, mapping locations, tracing last known movements. Patterns emerged more clearly with each pin on his map. The circle kept drawing back to the edges of Plaquemine. Something or someone was pulling men in and leaving no trace behind. And though Henry Dawson still moved freely, shovel in hand, believing his pit would never betray him, the net was tightening. The patience of grieving families was wearing thin. The files on Carter's desk grew heavier each week. All it would take was one careless step, one overlooked detail, to turn whispers into a knock on Henry Dawson's door. For years, Henry Dawson survived by preying on the invisible. He chose men no one would miss, buried them in silence, and convinced himself he was beyond suspicion. But arrogance is a fragile shield. By late 2021, Henry was so sure of his own cleverness that he stumbled into the one thing he had always avoided: a traceable mistake. The slip began with Michael Turner. Michael was 22, strong from labor but tender-hearted, living with his widowed mother outside Baton Rouge. He had been saving to help his sister with her wedding, taking odd jobs to keep the family afloat. Before leaving for Plaquemine, his mother pressed a folded grocery voucher into his hand. "Pick this up for us when you're done," she said. Michael promised he'd be home by nightfall. Henry found him at the bus stop, spinning the same false kindness he'd used so many times before. There was work to be done on the farm, pay waiting at the end of the day. Michael followed, eager to earn. In the Dawson kitchen, Martha served him a simple meal. She couldn't lift her eyes to his face for long. Something about his gentleness, the way he thanked her for the bread, made her chest ache. She knew what the evening would bring. Later, as Henry led Michael into the yard, Martha remained by the window, listening to the muffled sounds that had become the rhythm of her nights. She pressed her hands over her ears, but she couldn't block the truth. When it was over, Henry rifled through Michael's pockets. The grocery voucher fell into his hand. It bore the Turner name and the signature of a local grocer, a slip of paper that connected the young man to a family waiting just a few miles away. For a moment, Henry's eyes narrowed. The cautious move would have been to burn it, but greed whispered louder. To him, it wasn't a risk. It was free food. 2 days later, Henry shuffled into the store, voucher in hand. The clerk, Mrs. Adams, recognized the name instantly. She had known the Turners for years. "Turner?" she repeated slowly, her eyes narrowing as she took in Henry's sunken face and restless gaze. "How'd you come by this?" Henry's smile was thin, dismissive. "The boy owed me, paid me this way," he said, as if the matter were beneath question. But Mrs. Adams felt her skin prickle. She remembered the flyer tacked to the bulletin board by the door, Michael Turner missing. His mother had been in only days before, begging for any word, and now here was this strange man, claiming his voucher. She handed over the groceries, but her silence was heavy, her eyes sharp. Henry left without noticing the weight of her stare. By nightfall, word had spread. The Turners came to the store, grief tightening into anger when they heard what Mrs. Adams had seen. The description was unmistakable. A wiry, shifty-eyed man from the edge of town. Neighbors whispered the name almost in unison, Henry Dawson. Back at the farmhouse, Henry gloated over the groceries as if he had won some private victory. Martha sat across the room, her stomach churning. She had heard whispers in town, seen flyers multiply on walls and windows, and now, watching Henry grin over bags of food, she felt the walls closing in. It was no longer a question of if, but when. Detective Raymond Carter received the report within days. He pinned it to the growing stack on his desk, the first tangible lead in a mountain of shadows. A local recluse, already odd in the eyes of neighbors, now directly tied to a missing man. For the first time, the puzzle pieces began to touch. Henry, blind to the danger, still believed he was untouchable. He mistook the silence outside for ignorance, never realizing it was the breath before a storm. Families were gathering, neighbors were whispering, and the law had finally found a name. The Dawson farm had hidden its secrets for years. Now, because of one slip of paper waved too carelessly, those secrets were no longer safe. The Turners and others were on their way to his doorstep. The rumor spread quickly through Plaquemine, whispered in grocery aisles, church pews, and on back porches until the Turners were no longer alone in their grief. Other families had come with photographs of sons, brothers, and husbands who had disappeared, and each story led back to the same name. Henry Dawson, the reclusive farmer on the edge of town, was no longer just an odd neighbor. He was a man whose silence had become too suspicious to ignore. Michael Turner's mother could not wait any longer for the police to connect the dots. Sleepless and gaunt, she pressed her eldest son Samuel to act, and soon he gathered neighbors and other grieving relatives, forming a small convoy that rolled down the dirt road with headlights cutting through the dusk, their engines loud in the heavy southern air and their determination rising with every mile. The Dawson farmhouse came into view, slouched and crooked among the trees, its shutters sagging and its yard unnervingly quiet. Samuel knocked hard, and when the door creaked open, Henry appeared short, wiry, his eyes darting like an animal that knows the trap has been set. "What do you want?" he asked flatly, trying to sound annoyed rather than afraid. Michael's mother stepped forward, clutching her son's photograph in both hands, her voice shaking as she said, "My boy came here. He never came home. Tell me where he is." For a moment, Henry's expression faltered, but then he forced a thin smile and muttered, "Don't know what you're talking about." Lots of men passed through. The lie only deepened the fury on the porch. Samuel stepped closer, his voice hard and steady. "The grocer saw you with my brother's voucher." "Stop lying." Henry's jaw tightened, and he tried to slam the door, but the family surged forward together, blocking him. Questions came at him all at once about sons and brothers and missing men, his muttered denials crumbling under the weight of voices demanding truth. Inside, Martha stood rigid in the hallway. For years she had prayed in silence for someone to come, and now the sound of neighbors filling the house sent her knees trembling. She gripped the edge of a table to keep from falling, whispering a prayer she dared not voice aloud. Henry struggled as Samuel and two others seized his arms, forcing them behind his back. Rope was found, rough and quick, binding him not in vengeance but in determination that he would finally answer to the law. Martha pressed her hand to her mouth as tears came, not from fear but from the sudden release of years of silence. When her eyes met Michael's mother's, something wordless passed between them, recognition, grief, and a shared understanding that Henry's shadow had consumed them both in different ways. Neighbors gathered outside at the sound of shouting. Some gasped at the sight of Henry bound, others shook their heads in disbelief, but no one stepped forward to defend him. For years they had dismissed the strange smells and the flickering lantern light as quirks of a recluse. Now the evidence stood before them, undeniable. The families loaded Henry into the back of a truck, his curses spilling into the night as he thrashed and spat, claiming innocence with words no one believed. The convoy rolled toward town, headlights burning through the darkness, the man who had hidden behind soil and silence now bound and powerless. Martha stood in the doorway, her thin frame silhouetted by the failing light. She did not follow, but for the first time in years she felt Henry's shadow lift from her shoulders. Yet freedom was heavy, because she knew what the earth behind the farmhouse concealed. Every mound of dirt, every sleepless night, every lantern-lit burial pressed on her chest like a stone, and she understood that the families had only begun to learn what she had carried for years. At the sheriff's office, Detective Raymond Carter met the group at the door. He had spent months piecing together fragments of disappearances, and now the families had brought him the missing link. Carter studied Henry, saw arrogance flicker into fear in his eyes, and knew that this was no coincidence. Henry tried a final bluff, sneering at the crowd. "You can't prove nothing." But the words rang hollow, swallowed by the silence of those who had waited too long for answers. For the families, Henry's capture was not closure. Their loved ones were still gone, their fates unknown. Yet for the first time, hope flickered that the truth, however grim, might finally come to light. And for law enforcement, the path was clear. The Dawson farm would be searched, and the soil that had kept its secrets for years would soon be forced to speak. The morning after Henry Dawson was locked in a cell, Plaquemine stirred with uneasy energy. Word of his capture moved quickly, and with it came both dread and hope. Families who had waited months for answers gathered quietly in town, watching and whispering, while inside the sheriff's office, Detective Raymond Carter prepared the next step. Henry's arrest was only the beginning. To understand the scope of what had happened, the Dawson farm would have to be searched from the ground up. By noon, a convoy of patrol cars rolled down the dirt road, their tires crunching gravel as deputies and investigators stepped out under a heavy southern Sunday. The farmhouse leaned crooked among the trees, its silence thick as if the walls themselves were holding secrets. Carter ordered the property sealed with yellow tape, and uniformed men took positions. Then the search began. Inside, the rooms were dim, the air carrying not just the must of old wood, but a sharper odor that clung stubbornly. Dust-covered furniture, yet scattered across the floor and stuffed in corners, were things that didn't belong to Henry or Martha. A wallet without money, a pair of muddy boots, a wristwatch crusted with dirt. Each item was tagged and bagged, and with each one Carter felt a knot form tighter in his chest. These were pieces of lives cut short. Martha sat at the kitchen table under supervision, her frail hands folded as if in prayer, her gaze locked on nothing. When Carter asked her softly if there was more to see, her lips trembled before she whispered, "The yard." She did not look up, and the words seemed to drain the strength from her. Outside, the investigators fanned across the property. The soil looked uneven in places, some patches darker than others. When the wind shifted, a faint odor rose from the ground, unmistakable even before the dogs began barking and scratching near the tree line. Carter gave the order, and shovels struck the dirt. At first it was cautious, each deputy hoping the suspicion might prove wrong, but soon the earth yielded what no one could deny. A pale bone surfaced, then another, and silence fell over the men digging. With grim resolve, they continued until a shallow grave was uncovered, holding the remains of two men tangled together. Carter pressed a hand to his face, steadying himself, before ordering the search widened. What followed was hours of methodical, heartbreaking work. The sun slid low, but floodlights were hauled in so the digging could continue. More graves appeared, each offering up fragments, boots, belt buckles, scraps of cloth, and beneath them, the forms of those who had vanished. The smell grew stronger, but even more unbearable was the knowledge that each discovery meant a family's worst fear confirmed. Some deputies stepped aside to catch their breath, then returned, compelled to continue because mothers and fathers were waiting just beyond the tape. Crowds gathered at the edge of the property as word spread. They stood in silence now, not shouting or gasping, but clutching photographs, holding one another, bracing for the moment a deputy would emerge with a bag that might hold all that was left of someone they loved. The sobs that did break through were muffled, carried on the night air with the steady scrape of shovels. Inside the farmhouse, Martha remained by the window. She could not watch, but she heard everything: the bark of dogs, the calls of deputies, the stifled cries from the crowd. Each sound tore at her, because she had lived with this truth for years, unable to speak it aloud. She pressed a crumpled handkerchief in her fist until the seams split, whispering words no one else could hear. Apologies to the men buried outside, prayers for their families, pleas for forgiveness she knew would never come. By the time midnight approached, the yard looked scarred and open, patches of earth turned into shallow craters. Carter stood under the floodlights, his face drawn as he looked over the excavation. They had uncovered far more than anyone wanted to believe, and yet he knew the digging was not finished. At the edge of the property, near the tree line, lay the beginnings of a wider pit, a place that suggested Henry had been planning for more. The thought made Carter's chest tighten. This was not just a crime scene. It was a graveyard disguised as farmland, a place where silence had allowed horror to live unchecked. Neighbors who had once waved at Henry from a distance now whispered to each other in disbelief. For years they had dismissed the smells, the strange lights, the unease that lingered near the property. Now the earth itself was proving what they had refused to see. For the families, the discovery brought no peace, only the sharpest edge of truth. Some would never have more than fragments to bury, but at least the long torment of not knowing was ending. For Martha, the night was a quiet undoing. The shadow that had hung over her for years was being torn away by floodlights and shovels, leaving her both freed and exposed. And for Henry Dawson, sitting miles away in a cell, the silence he had trusted for so long was broken beyond repair. The ground that had once hidden his crimes was now shouting his guilt. Tomorrow it would be his turn to face the questions he had avoided for years, and there would be no soil left to cover the truth. The night after the search, with floodlights still burning over the Dawson farm, Henry sat shackled in a small interrogation room. The walls were bare, the light harsh, and the air thick with the weight of what had already been found. He slouched in his chair, wiry frame twitching with nervous energy, yet his eyes gleamed as if he still held some advantage. Across the table, Detective Raymond Carter remained silent, studying him the way a hunter studies a cornered animal. Minutes stretched until the silence became unbearable. Henry shifted and finally sneered, "You dug holes, found bones. That's all you got. Dirt can't testify." Carter did not answer. Instead, he slid a photograph across the table. Michael Turner, smiling in the picture his family had provided. Then another photo, and another, until the table was filled with faces, sons, brothers, fathers. Carter spoke quietly, his voice even but firm. "These men deserve more than the ground you left them in. Tell me what happened to them." Henry looked down at the photos and gave a low laugh. "What happened?" "Same thing that happens to strays. They wander, they get lost, nobody comes looking. I gave them a place to end up, that's all." His tone was almost casual, as if he were describing broken tools rather than lives stolen. He leaned back, chains rattling at his wrists. "You want tears? Forget it. They were nothing. Nobody's. If they mattered, they wouldn't have ended up with me." Carter's jaw tightened, but he kept control. He pushed one photo forward, Michael again. This boy had a mother who still waits at her window every night. He was her whole world. To you, he was a stray. To her, he was everything. For the first time, Henry's grin faltered, just a flicker, before he shrugged it away. If he was everything, she should have kept him closer. That's what families do if they care. Don't blame me for seeing what was left out in the open. His words dripped with bitterness, as though he wanted to wound more than defend himself. Behind the glass, deputies clenched their fists, anger rising at each word. Carter held up a hand, keeping the room steady. He understood Henry's game. Provoke, belittle, pretend control. Still, he pressed on. "Tell me how you chose them," he asked. Henry tilted his head, and for once, answered without hesitation. He spoke of watching bus stops, of spotting the ones with no luggage, no friends waiting, the ones who looked desperate for work. "They were easy," he said with a thin smile. "Work a day, eat a meal, then they were gone. Like pulling weeds from a field. You don't count weeds, you don't name them, you just clear them out." His words chilled the room. Each detail came not as confession but as boast, the pride of a man who thought himself clever for so long. Yet in the rhythm of his speech, Carter caught something, a faint crack in his armor. Beneath the arrogance lay a man clinging to the illusion that he had been in control. When Martha's name entered the conversation, Henry's tone sharpened. "Don't make her out to be innocent," he said quickly. "She cooked for them. She set the table. She knew they weren't walking back out. She wasn't holding a light like some saint in the dark. She knew where everybody was." Carter watched him carefully, hearing not only accusation but spite, the venom of a man eager to drag someone down with him. The truth of Martha's role would be for the court to weigh, but the cruelty in Henry's voice revealed as much about him as any fact. Hours passed in the close room. Carter circled back with questions, pressing for details, and Henry gave them with a strange mix of precision and indifference, describing shallow pits, the way he marked trees so he wouldn't dig the same spot twice, the satisfaction he felt when no one came asking. "Planting, harvesting, burying," he murmured once, almost to himself. "All the same thing, just different crops." By the end, Carter stacked the photographs neatly again, his expression unreadable. He looked at Henry and spoke with quiet certainty. "Every one of these men had a name, a life, and a family that loved them. They'll be remembered. You won't." Henry leaned forward, eyes flashing. "Remember this, though, I almost beat you. If it hadn't been for that little voucher, I'd still be out there. You'd never have touched me." Carter did not blink. "Almost doesn't count. And when the trial begins, every detail you thought you buried will be spoken aloud. The silence you trusted is gone, Henry. It belongs to us now." For the first time, Henry had no answer. His grin slipped, and the room fell into a silence that no longer belonged to him, but to the law that would carry him to judgment. The trial of Henry Dawson opened in the spring of 2022, and by then the courthouse in Plaquemine had become more than a building. It was the place where years of unanswered grief would finally be spoken aloud. Before dawn, families gathered on the steps, clutching photographs of missing sons and brothers, their faces marked by sleepless nights. Neighbors stood beside them, some with signs demanding justice, others silent, simply waiting for the doors to open. Inside, the air felt taut, as though the walls themselves braced for what was about to unfold. When Henry was brought in, shackled at the wrists, the room shifted with a low murmur. He carried himself stiffly, not with shame but with a defiance that unsettled everyone watching. His eyes scanned the crowded benches, settling briefly on the rows of grieving families, then sliding away as if their pain were nothing to him. He tapped his fingers lightly on the table, a restless rhythm that betrayed the tension beneath his outward calm. Martha followed, escorted by deputies. She looked smaller than anyone remembered, her shoulders hunched, her gaze fixed on the floor. In her hands, she clutched a tissue so tightly that it shredded at the edges. Some in the gallery glared at her, convinced she had been part of Henry's crimes. Others looked at her with pity, seeing only a woman hollowed by years of fear. The question of whether she was accomplice or victim hovered in every whispered conversation, waiting for testimony to tip the scale. The prosecution built its case, piece by piece. Photographs of the yard were displayed on a large screen. Uneven soil, tagged evidence markers, the outlines of graves. Deputy after deputy testified about what they had unearthed: boots, wallets, belts, all identified by family members who stood shaking as they confirmed what once belonged to their loved ones. Each recognition drew muffled sobs, each object a reminder that behind the evidence lay human lives. Henry listened, with a face that shifted between boredom and irritation. When called to respond, he leaned into the microphone and said evenly, "I don't deny what they found. But don't pretend it's some grand tragedy. The world's full of men who don't matter. I just cut a few loose." The words hung in the air like poison. Gasps erupted from the benches, and a woman in the second row cried out before deputies helped her from the room. The judge hammered his gavel, demanding order, but the outrage was impossible to contain completely. When Martha was called, the atmosphere turned heavy with expectation. Her voice was thin, almost breaking, as she recounted nights of dread, the sound of shovels in the dark, the smell of fresh dirt drifting through the windows, the way Henry would scrub mud from his clothes at the sink long after midnight. She admitted to setting food before men she knew would never eat again, to hearing muffled cries outside but lacking the courage to move or speak. "He told me if I opened my mouth, "I'd be the next one in the ground," she whispered, twisting the torn tissue in her hands. Her words drew tears from some listeners, but when the prosecutor pressed harder, why had she never tried to escape, never sought help, never whispered even a warning? Others shook their heads in anger. Her testimony painted her as both captive and silent witness, and the line between victim and accomplice blurred more with every word. Outside, crowds gathered daily, standing shoulder to shoulder in the Louisiana heat. News cameras captured their faces, mothers holding framed portraits, neighbors speaking of unease they had ignored, strangers outraged that such horror could grow in quiet farmland. Yet unlike the shouting matches of earlier days, much of the crowd now waited in tense silence, hanging on each update from inside the courtroom. They wanted not just punishment but understanding, some explanation of how this had been allowed to happen. Closing arguments distilled weeks of testimony into sharp contrasts. The prosecution called Henry a predator who saw men as weeds to be cleared, reminding the jury of his own words spoken without remorse. They argued Martha, while abused, had still chosen silence that enabled dozens of deaths. The defense clung to her frailty, insisting she was more prisoner than partner, a woman broken by years of coercion. For Henry, there was no defense left. His arrogance had spoken louder than any lawyer could. When the verdict was read, the room held its breath. Guilty on all counts. A wave of sound rose from the benches, relief, sobs, murmurs of thanks, and deputies had to steady the families who collapsed in tears. Henry sat unmoved, his fingers drumming again on the table, as though the weight of the word guilty meant nothing. Martha broke down in sobs, her shoulders shaking, the tissue crumpled and wet in her hands. The gavel struck, sealing what had already been written in the hearts of everyone present. Henry Dawson would never walk free again. Outside, the crowd swelled with noise, but not triumph. Some wept openly, others stood in stunned silence, and still others asked the questions that would not leave them. Could Martha truly be judged alongside Henry? And would any sentence ever equal the lives already lost? From the back of the courtroom, Detective Carter watched quietly. The verdict brought justice, but not peace. The chairs left empty at family tables would remain empty, and the scar on Plaquemine would not fade quickly. The trial had ended, but the final weight of sentencing still waited, and with it, the community's last chance to measure justice against the depth of its grief. Even after justice is spoken, stories like this leave us with heavy hearts. They remind us that silence in the face of cruelty can be as dangerous as the cruelty itself. Families and communities must stay watchful, must listen when someone cries out, and must never let fear bury the truth. Evil often begins quietly, in hidden corners, and it grows when no one dares to shine a light on it. But just as darkness cannot withstand a single flame, cruelty cannot survive when good people stand together. If this story touched you, I encourage you to reflect on your own community, your own family, and the importance of speaking up for what is right. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, stories that uncover the hidden, remind us of resilience, and keep alive the lessons of justice, please subscribe to this channel. By joining, you help keep these voices heard, and together, we honor the memory of those who cannot speak for themselves.